Hello and welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist Kimberley Hoeppner, and today is July 3rd, 2019. Now, when we're not here, you can always reach out to us by our phone line. This is our phone line so you can get your forecast. That's digitized, 1-800-472-0391. And you can also go on the internet by searching weather.gov/Alaska and just click on any destination of your choice and you can get your forecast that way. If you have any questions about the show or anything on the internet, you can feel free to write our TV desk lead, and that's david.snider@noaa.gov. Now we're going to go on to the important topics for the next week. I'm going to step off the screen here so you can read these headlines with me. The first one that we're going to address is the dry conditions across the Panhandle. Now this has been a serious problem, and they are asking for Southeast residents to conserve water usage because this gets very expensive as they're running generators at this point. So electricity is very expensive, so cut back on that water usage. For rain totals now, on the flip side of things, for the Seward Peninsula, a front rolled through the western areas of the state last night. Through today, bring 1 to 3 inches of rain for this area. And the last thing to mention, the prevailing forecast is going to go back to warm and dry across Alaska. So let's go talk about also the important headlines as we head into this weekend. First thing to know, ongoing conditions for smoke across the Seward Peninsula due to the Swan Fire. That's going to be shifting its pattern. It already has and has been affecting the eastern side of the peninsula, and that's going to continue. So as we go through the end of the week, we'll see some changes in the wind flow pattern. So it might shift a little bit further west at times, but definitely we're keeping an eye on that eastern areas, especially as we head into the holiday, and there's a lot of people that are heading in that direction. The other thing that we've issued this afternoon out of the Juneau Forecast Office is a red flag watch, and we're seeing this for much of the northern channels. We're going to have those warm, dry conditions setting up and continuing. So they're asking not to burn anything, or anything that can spark a fire would quickly grow under the conditions that they're heading into through the end of the week. So that's out there till Friday. The smoke advisory, that will probably be continued until we see some improvement for that Swan Fire. Now the fire danger across the southern areas of the state, they're going to continue to increase and expand. So expect by tomorrow, after this front moves off to the east and northeast direction, that those areas are going to grow in expansion and expand coverage across the state. Now let's take a look at the upper level maps, bring the weather across the state. You can see that there's a very notable clockwise spin, kind of centered near the western areas of the Gulf. And so that big area is just the low pressure that we've been talking about for the last few days. So that's going to be setting back up, and here's the front across the central Aleutians expanding towards the northwestern areas of the state, bringing some clouds towards the central interior this afternoon. So just putting a spin into that one more time, you can see that steady stream of moisture. However, the bulk of the moisture is staying out towards the west. So the frontal boundary is kind of in a stalled pattern currently near Dead Horse, stretching back towards the Yukon Delta here, and then back towards the Aleutians. Now this is a warm air mass in general, but another low pressure system connected towards the north is actually bringing cooler temperatures to the northwest coast there. Now out to the west, there's ridging that's building back into the Bering, and another notable ridge today is here just south of the Alaska Peninsula. This is kind of the ridge that's going to also help it build into the southern areas of the state. And then across the Kenai Peninsula, we have smoke symbols out there for the smoke that's kind of flowing in an offshore pattern right now. Today, this afternoon, was really interesting. Kodiak Island had gone up to 82 degrees by 3 o'clock this afternoon, so that's kind of rare in the summer for them. And we also have temperatures back into the upper 80s pretty much across the Susitna and the Copper River Basin. Across the southeast, their temperatures were pretty cool this afternoon, staying in the 60-degree range for most of the area. They have a really strong marine layer just off the coast locations. So until that ridge builds in a little bit further, they're going to see a little bit cooler conditions through the overnight hours. Now let's look at the pattern as we shift into the overnight hours. We still have this low pressure, weak low pressure influence from the offshore flow over the state. Not a very strong low pressure system, but in contrast to the ridging that's just to the west of it, we'll, for that sake, call it a low pressure. Now, across the southeast, we're going to see that fog that developed this morning push back in during the overnight hours, and the fog will also possibly push into the Prince William Sound during the overnight time frame too, perhaps Cordova, but mainly stratus along the western Gulf, with the main area of fog being over the central and eastern waters. Now across the interior, expect some light showers for Fairbanks and east, but we are seeing some smoke starting to creep back into the Fairbanks area with that. The winds are out of the west direction, so the smoke is going to start pushing back into Fairbanks. Now the front across the northern tier of the state, the broad brushed area, just to indicate where you might see showers, but certainly not for the amount, because the front is going to begin to weaken during the overnight hours, so we're not going to see too much activity there. Now the front across this western areas of the Bering and the central Aleutians here, that's going to begin to continue to shift to the west, but primarily just keeping rain over those areas. Now ridging across the western areas of the state, you can see that building back in with a 1027 millibar ridge inland, a 1020 millibar ridge across the Gulf, and then the smoke areas, here we are spreading back into much of the state. The front's going to hang on for one more day, bring showers, mainly from the central interior and to the northeast Beaufort seacoast, with fog possible across the northwest coast, so cooler conditions for Thursday there. Now for your Friday weather, we're going to continue to see this ridge begin to dominate for the end of the week. Looking for possible showers, however, diurnal heating and moisture just available in the lower levels, probably across the Talkeetna Mountains, perhaps across the Aleutian Range as well there. And then we'll see some showers across the northwest and some patchy fog for your Friday morning, with that beginning to diminish in the afternoon. The marine fog is going to stay for the morning hours and possibly creep into some of the areas across the coast, in the outer coast, but primarily should stay over the Gulf waters. Now let's take a look to the west. Here's the system diminishing, and the ridge is going to be taking control of most of the state by Friday. Now let's look at your temperatures. Your low temperatures for tonight across the state are mainly going to be in the upper 40s to mid 50s, the warmest across the interior locations of the state. Now for the southeast, look at temperatures around that 55-degree mark. As we head into Thursday, here's that warm pattern across the south and southwestern areas of the state first. The southeast will see one more day in the lower 70s to lower 80s late day. Depending on how quickly the stratus clears off, the northern tier of the state is going to range between the mid-50s to the mid-60s. Out west, looking at temperatures primarily in the mid-40s to mid-50s. As we head into your Friday morning forecast, very similar pattern, keeping temperature ranges between 40 to the mid-50s across the state. Looking at temperatures also near that 55-degree mark for the southeast. Now let's take a look at your temperatures. We're expecting those temperatures to peak on Friday as that ridge begins to build right back into the state and keeps everything dry across the southeast, allowing those temperatures to move back up into the mid-80s, 85 for Juneau for the weekend, heading into the weekend there. And then into the 80s to near 90 degrees once again for across much of the areas of the southern tier of the state. Interior, we'll see those temperatures also creeping back into the 70s and 80s. We'll be looking for the possibility of some isolated thunderstorms near Talkeetna, but right now It doesn't look like it's going to be that moist, so hopefully they'll stay in the showery side rather than thunderstorms. Across the west, here we are back up into the 80s across most of the state, stretching out into the Bering is where it's going to be cooler into the upper 40s to mid 50s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to the aviation part of the show, we're going to first start across the southeastern areas of the state. Looking at Thursday morning, we're going to start off with MVFR to IFR conditions as we do have a marine layer that's going to push into the southeast during the morning hours, and that's going to spread all the way across back towards Prince William Sound. We're going to start the day mostly VFR conditions for the southern areas of the state and across the Alaska and Canadian border. Looking off to the north, IFR and MVFR conditions will be widespread, and across the Bering waters, we're looking at widespread IFR conditions to start your day. However, as we get into Thursday afternoon, some improvement there along the southwest coast and up through the Seward Peninsula. However, they do hang on to some IFR conditions there to the northwest. Now looking at the Gulf, we should see some improvement, and for the southeast, your afternoon should look like VFR as will be much of the southern part of the state, even clearing there through the Kuskokwim Delta mostly. The YK Delta here, however, will hang on to some MVFR late day. Now heading into your Friday morning, a repeat with the marine layer staying across the Gulf locations. So widespread MVFR and IFR to start your day, but the areas across the inland locations will mainly be VFR, except for some MVFR conditions along the coast and just along the central Alaska range there. Along the north coast, expect MVFR conditions with some IFR conditions just offshore. Now for the Bering to start your day Friday morning, IFR conditions once a day. A little break there though. However, southwest of the Pribilof Islands could see improved MVFR conditions, which might make it into Dutch Harbor. However, Dutch Harbor is expecting to start the day IFR at this point. For Friday afternoon, we should see improvement across the inland locations. However, hanging on to some MVFR conditions, that might be due to some smoke too during the afternoon and some moisture around the ridge that's building across the southern areas of the state. Now look out for some thunderstorms across the Kenai as we go into the afternoon hours, as well as for the southeast should see some thunderstorm activity. However, the conditions, the IFR, MVFR conditions across the Gulf is going to be improving quite a bit on Friday afternoon. Across the northern tier of the state, hanging on to that MVFR and IFR conditions down through the central areas of the Bering, which is going to stay mostly IFR through your day on Friday. Looking at the passes in more depth, we're going to see Anaktuvik go from IFR on Thursday to VFR during the afternoon. Same for Anaktuvik. Adigan Pass is going to go IFR to VFR. Looking at Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, both VFR for Thursday, and Rainy will be VFR. And Windy Pass is going to be in that MVFR range across the central range there, and Isabel is going to be a VFR all day. Looking at Mentasta, looking at VFR conditions for you, and Tanita will also be VFR. VFR for Portage for Thursday, and Chilkoot and White Pass, possibly MVFR in the morning, but that should clear up pretty quick to VFR conditions. For your freezing levels tomorrow, we have basically 8,000 to 14,000 feet from north to south across the state, the 12,000 foot level off to the eastern areas as well, and then decreasing 12,000 to 8,000 feet across the Bering. Now let's take a look at the icing, mainly just across the Bering. From the north to south will be above 10,000 to above 12,000 along the chain there. Now looking at your jet stream for tomorrow, it's going to be a very amplified pattern as this ridge rebuilds across the Gulf of Alaska with very high speeds between 60 to 100 knots on the western periphery of that low ridge, and then we have the low just off there to the west. Across the eastern areas of the state, more of a northerly flow with very light winds coming around the base of this ridge. So kind of stuck in this pattern here at 9,000 feet, winds changing direction around this ridge. Strongest winds will be on the west side between 25 to 45 knots across the Bering, looking at flow across the northern areas of the state also in that 30 to 40 knot range. And then very similar between 9 and 3,000 feet with this low pressure here, winds changing direction along the Bering and lighter wind speeds across much of the state. So the turbulent areas are going to mainly be on the western areas of the state and the Bering.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of their systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
Averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar. And ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there, or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out-of-state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so it'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Now on to the marine portion of the show. Let's take a look at the sea ice edge. Across the Chukchi Sea, we're seeing ice continue to erode, and as well as the eastern Beaufort Sea coast there. What we're going to see with the southerly flow pattern through the next few days is going to be a push northward of the ice. So might see some ice actually pushing off the coast there along the north coast waters. So that is the general flow pattern through the next few days. Now let's move on to the southeast, where they're actually seeing a northerly flow for your Thursday forecast, looking at relatively light flow pattern here. 2-foot seas across the inner channels and up to 5-foot seas across the outer waters for your Friday forecast, looking for a little bit more wind speed, up to 15 knots across the area. Offshore flow pattern with seas between 3 to 6 feet across, with the outer waters seeing the highest seas there. Now for the areas for the western and northern parts of the Gulf, primarily an offshore pattern as well, with the strongest winds at the southern tip of the Kenai there, with northwesterly flow bring small crafts for your Thursday, and then seas will be between 2 to 6 feet, highest seas near the Kenai Peninsula. Now for your Friday forecast, the wind speeds will lighten. So Friday, expect seas to also be lower, between 1 to 3 feet for the area. And then for your southwest on Thursday, expecting across the peninsula winds primarily out of the north direction, except just south of the Alaska Peninsula there from the southwest. And then we'll see seas between 4 to 5 feet, a little bit higher seas closer to Kodiak, up to 6. And then as we head into Friday, here's those wind speeds coming back down, a little shift of wind direction there. Seas will be between 2 to 5 feet. For much of the Aleutians, we're going to see the stronger flow with that front out there across the central Aleutians, some rain, and bring some gusty small craft winds. Change of wind direction back there towards Shemya out of the west direction. For your Friday, persistent pattern, but those winds are going to be coming down. So expect seas between 5 to 9 feet. Just along the eastern Aleutians for your Friday, we're going to see those small craft advisory winds. For the west coast and for the central Aleutian, or the central areas of the water, for the Pribilofs, we're going to see more of a southerly flow. It's up an offshore component there near the Kuskokwim Delta. Light wind speeds under small craft anyway. And then we'll see between 5 to 8 foot seas. As we head into your Friday, shift of wind directions expected between 15 to 20 knots. It's up a little bit more southerly as you head towards Safungo, St. Lawrence Island there. A little bit more of an offshore flow near Nome. We're expecting speeds to remain light with the seas between 2 to 7 feet. Looking at your northwest and north coast on Thursday, stronger winds there for the west coast, pushing between 25 to 30 knots. And we'll see seas on this day between 2 to 6 feet. On Friday, very similar pattern, small craft across the west coast there with the winds a little bit stronger across the east out of the west at 20 knots. Now for tonight, just to recap your forecast, we're going to have that stalled frontal boundary across the central areas of the Bering into the northern tier of the state. And then we'll see fog conditions across the waters. And then we're going to see haze out for the southeast for the 3rd into the 4th. Expect smoke, dense smoke across the Kenai to continue. Dry conditions for the southeast and for much of the south. Settling in for tomorrow, we have that ridge beginning to push further into the state, bringing temperatures up across most of the southern tier of the state, bringing temperatures into the low to mid 80s. And then across the northern tier, the front will be diminishing. The front will hang on across the central areas of the Bering until Friday, and then it will be breaking up with the ridge really making a comeback across the western parts of the state and moving into the south. So all areas on Friday will become drier, and of course the smoke is going to become more of a widespread issue as we head into the end of the week. So be careful with camping fires and keep it at a minimum. Make sure they're put out when you're leaving the fires. Have a safe week.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.